The midwife hadn't even packed her bag yet. My son was maybe 40 minutes old, still wet against my chest, and I was shaking the way you shake after that deep, cold shaking that comes up from somewhere underneath your bones, the kind nobody ever warns you about. And across the room, at the foot of the bed, my husband was already holding it in his hands. What he had come for, what he was allowed to take. He didn't ask me. He didn't look at me. He just took it, folded it once, and put it away inside his coat before the midwife had even finished washing the blood from her hands. Before I tell you what he took, and why every word I'm about to say is going to make some of you furious, I need you to understand something that took me years to be able to say out loud. In my community, nothing about that morning was wrong. Nothing. Not one part of it. He was permitted. It was his right. That is the part I still cannot fully explain, even now. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in a settlement in Wayne County, Ohio, and this is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where I say the things I was raised to carry to my grave in silence. If you want the truth about plain life from someone who actually lived inside it, not the tourist version you see from the buggy tours, not the postcard with the sunset behind the barn, then subscribe, tap the like button, and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from. I read every single one. And tell me this too, before you know the rest of it. What do you think an Amish husband is allowed to take from his wife the morning after she has given birth? Hold your guess. You will want to remember it later. Let me take you back into that room, because you have to feel it the way I felt it, or none of the rest will land the way it should. I was 20 years old. It was my first child. I had labored through the whole of a long autumn night in the same narrow bed I'd been sleeping in since my wedding, in a house my husband and his brothers had raised in a single week the summer before. There was no hospital, no doctor coming. There was a lay midwife named Fanny, a broad, quiet woman who had caught more babies in that county than any physician ever born. And there was a single kerosene lamp turned low on the dresser, and there was my mother somewhere down at the bottom of the stairs boiling water and saying nothing. Because that is what the women in my family did. They boiled the water and they folded the cloths, and they said nothing at all. By the time the gray light came up in the window, I had a son, and I remember the exact moment the pain stopped mattering to me, because Fanny laid him down on my chest and he was warm and furious and impossibly alive, his little fists going, and I thought with my whole heart, this is the only thing I will ever need. I was still lying there thinking it, still shaking, still holding him, when I heard my husband move across the floorboards behind me. Here's what people outside of my world don't understand about Amish life, and I have to explain it before I go any further, or none of what happened will make any sense. In the plain world, a marriage is not a partnership the way outsiders like to picture it. It is an order. The word we used for the whole of it was the ordnung, the unwritten but iron-strict code that governs every single thing, from the width of a man's hat brim, to who speaks first at the supper table, to what belongs to whom. And underneath that order, a woman does not own very much. Not really. Not in the way the English world means the word own. The house is the husband's. The land is the husband's. The money from the milk, all of it flows through him and none of it stops with her. A wife keeps the home, and she bears the children, and the fruit of every hour of that labor is not legally, not culturally, and not spiritually hers to keep. I grew up knowing this the way you know the sun comes up in the east. Nobody ever sat me down and explained it. You simply absorbed it out of the air. You watched your own mother take every dollar she earned selling eggs and quilts and hand it straight into your father's open hand, and never once think to keep a single coin of it back, because to keep it back would have been hochmut, pride, and pride was the deepest and most dangerous sin we had. A woman who wanted things for herself, who kept things back, who dared to say the words, "This is mine," that woman was proud, and proud was perilous. And proud women were the ones talked about in low voices at the far end of the quilting frolic. So when I tell you what my husband took from me that morning, I need you to hold two things at the very same time. It was wrong, and it was completely, perfectly, unremarkably normal. What he took was the caul. My son had been born with a caul. A piece of the birthing membrane, thin and pale as wet paper, draped clean across his face and the crown of his head as he came into the world. Fanny lifted it away from his features with 2 careful fingers so that he could take his first breath, and then she pressed it out flat onto a clean square of cloth, smoothing it the way you would press a flower inside the pages of a Bible. And in the old belief that ran underneath our faith like a second hidden river, a river the bishops pretended for 100 years was not there. A caul was a thing of real power. A child born inside the caul was blessed, protected, marked out. And the caul itself, once it was dried and kept, was said to protect whoever carried it. A caul-bearer could never drown, the old women said, even the ones who had never once seen the ocean and never in their lives would. And in my community, the caul belonged to the father. Not the mother who had carried him and torn to bring him here, not the child himself, the father. It was his to take, his to keep, his to dry between 2 clean cloths and fold away into paper and carry in his pocket for the rest of his life. His protection now, earned through no labor of his own, taken instead from a body that was not his, while that body was still shaking and bleeding there on the bed. That was the tradition. That was permitted. My husband had watched his own father take his caul, decades before, in a room just like that one. He was only doing what the men in his line had always done, going back further than anyone living could remember. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are, so I wrote the rest down instead. Slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now let me tell you why that small dried square of membrane broke something inside of me that it took me years to even find the name for. It wasn't the caul. Let me be honest with you the way that nobody in my whole life was ever honest with me. It was never really about the caul at all. A dried piece of birth tissue has no power in it. I know that now. I think I knew it, somewhere down deep, even then. What broke me was the reach. It was the hand that came into the most sacred 40 minutes of my entire life, and took something before I was even asked whether I wanted to hold it myself, before I even knew it existed. My son had been alive in this world for less than 1 single hour, and already a decision about him, about a piece of him and a piece of me, had been made and carried out and folded away into a coat pocket, and I had not been any part of it. I was the bed that it happened on. That is all I was. The bed. My friend Ruth understood this long before I ever did. Ruth had married 2 years ahead of me and had 3 little ones before I had my first, and I remember standing in her warm kitchen when I was still a new bride, the both of us up to our wrists in bread dough. And Ruth said something so quietly that I very nearly missed it under the sound of the stove. She said, "You'll learn soon enough what's yours and what isn't. It's a short list. What's yours?" I laughed because I thought she was making a joke about husbands. She was not laughing. She just kept on kneading, her eyes down on the dough. And then she said, "Your prayers are yours. Nobody can ever take those. Everything else, don't you get attached." I was far too young to hear it. And I did not understand it, not truly, until the morning that Fanny pressed a caul onto a cloth, and my husband picked it up as though it had always already been his. I want to be very careful here, because I know exactly how this sounds, and I know what some of you are already typing down in the comments before I've even finished. My husband was not a cruel man. I need you to really hear me say that, because it matters, and because the truth of a thing is almost never as simple as a villain with a black hat. His name was Amish. He was gentle with the animals in a way that made the other men tease him. He was patient with the children, more patient than I was. He wept at his own father's funeral, in a way plain men were not supposed to weep, and did not hide it. He did not take that call because he wanted to cause me any pain. He took it because in 26 years of his life, not one single person had ever once suggested to him that it might be mine to give, rather than simply his to take. The reaching was so natural to him, so much the water he swam in, that he genuinely could not see a hand reaching at all. He saw a father, doing the thing that fathers do. And that is the thing I have had to sit with for years now, alone, in the quiet. The people who wound you the very deepest inside a system like that one are very often not doing a single thing the system ever told them was wrong. They are doing everything right. That is exactly what makes it so hard to stay angry, and so hard, at the very same time, to ever fully stop. Here's what nobody tells you about that morning, and about the 10,000 ordinary mornings that came marching in behind it. Nobody asked me how I was. Not that day, not the next day either. There was no room anywhere in our world for a woman to say that she felt as though something had been taken out of her, because to say a thing like that out loud was to admit that you had wanted to keep something for your own, and wanting to keep things for your own was pride, and pride was the poisoned root of every other sin there was. So I got up on the second morning, and I put on my dress, and I pinned my prayer cap up over my hair, and I made a full breakfast for the men with my newborn son in a basket at my feet, 3 days after tearing my own living body open to bring him here. And when a neighbor woman came over to help me, she did not ask about the birth either. She just looked at me a moment too long, the way that the older women always did, a look that carried whole sentences that could never be spoken. And then she said, "It goes easier if you don't hold too tight to any of it." And she turned and started in on the dishes. That was the true inheritance the women passed down to one another hand to hand, generation to generation. Not the recipes, not the quilt patterns. Don't hold too tight to any of it. They said it always sideways, over the dishwater and the bread dough, in the only language they were permitted. The language of things that sound like they are about laundry and are in truth about survival. I stayed for 11 more years. I bore 4 more children in that same narrow bed, and every single time, without one exception, the caul or the cord, or the very first cut lock of the baby's hair, or whatever it was the old tradition had marked out as the father's due, every single time it was taken before I was ever asked. And every single time something got a little quieter inside of me, because that is what the reaching does to a person when there is nobody there to stop it. It does not make you scream. That is what people get wrong. It makes you fold. I folded a little more with each child that came, until I was as flat and as pressed and as put away as that first call had been on Fanny's clean cloth. There was another woman I have to tell you about too, because she is the reason I am sitting here at all. Her name was Barbara, near 60, and she had buried a husband and outlived the worst of the shame that falls on a widow. She came to me the winter my 4th was born, and she found me crying in the cold pantry over spilled flour the way you cry when it is not about the flour. She did not tell me to be strong. She did not tell me it went easier if you didn't hold on. She put her old hand flat on the side of my face, and she said, "You were a person before you were a wife, Martha. There's a girl still in there. Don't you let them finish burying her." And then she left, because that was all the time the silence would allow her. When I finally packed the buggy in the dark 7 years later, it was Barbara's voice I heard, not my own. When I finally did leave, I was 31 years old, and I took every one of my children out with me, and the cost of it was everything you are already imagining and a good deal worse. The shunning came down over my whole life like a heavy door swinging shut. My mother, the one who boiled the water and said nothing, she began to return my letters to me unopened, my own handwriting on the front. My father would no longer take my hand. The entire community that had shown up for every birth and every barn raising and every funeral of my whole life simply all at once stopped seeing me the way you would lean over and blow out a lamp. And in the English world, in a small quiet office with a box of tissues on the low table between us, a therapist gave me words I had never been allowed to hold in my own 2 hands: autonomy, consent, ownership. She listened to the whole of the story of that morning, the call, the coat pocket, the shaking, the cold, and when I finally finished, she was quiet for a long moment. And then she said a thing that I have carried with me every single day since. She said, "Control almost never announces itself, Martha. It hardly ever kicks the door in. Most of the time it simply reaches right past you and takes the thing before you ever knew that it was yours to keep." And I sat there in that chair and understood at long last what Ruth had been trying to tell me a whole lifetime before. It's a short list. What's yours? They had made that list short on purpose. Because a woman who owns nothing at all has nothing she can ever leave with. And a woman who has been taught from birth that keeping is the same thing as pride will hand you over her whole entire life, one small piece at a time, and thank you softly for relieving her of the weight of carrying it. The call was never really about protection from drowning at all. It was practice. It was the very first small lesson, delivered to me barely 40 minutes into motherhood, in a language of dried membrane and folded cloth. This is not yours, and neither is anything else that you will ever love. And the sooner you stop reaching for any of it, the less all of it is going to hurt you. Now, here is where I have to be fair, because I promised myself the day I started this channel that I would always tell you both of the truths. And with a place like the one I come from, there are always two. The plain world gave me things that the English world simply cannot. It gave me a community with a texture you could lean your whole weight against and never feel it give. It gave me hands that showed up, for the harvest, for the sickness, for the grief, without being asked and without keeping score. It gave me a childhood of real silence, and real stars overhead with no wires across them, and real work that meant something. It gave me a faith that, as wounded as it is now, I have still never fully been able to set down. I will not sit here and tell you that it was all of it darkness, because that would be a lie, and the people who tell you these worlds are nothing but darkness are selling you something every bit as false as that postcard with the sunset on it. But there is no faith anywhere that requires a woman to own nothing at all. There is no scripture ever written that turns a birthing mother into a piece of the furniture. There is no God that I believe in now who would build a woman's body to do the very hardest and the very holiest work there is on this earth, and then turn around and decree that the whole fruit of it belonged instead to the man standing there at the foot of the bed with the empty coat pocket. That was never God. That was men. Men writing rules that they never once had to write down. Because the rules you never write down anywhere are the very hardest ones there are to ever change. If you grew up in a place where the word yours was itself a kind of sin, where you learned to fold instead of to hold, where the deepest lesson underneath all the other lessons was simply, don't you get attached, then I want you to hear me right now, because somebody should have said this to you a very long time ago, and no one ever did. Your body was yours. What came from your body was yours to give, and never once theirs to take. Wanting to keep the things that you love was never, ever pride. It was never a sin. It was the most human thing that there is in this whole world, and they taught you to be ashamed of it for one reason only. Because a woman who knows exactly what is hers is a woman who is very, very hard to keep. I was not too young to bring 5 children into this world in a bed with no doctor and no medicine and no word of complaint. I was only ever too unowned for anyone to think to tell me that a single piece of any of it was mine. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.